All right, so let me see if let me open up the README here. We're going to talk about React state events and forms today. This is going to be a lot of information. We're going to go through a lot of new concepts that you may or may not have touched upon yesterday or the past few days. So we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about importing and exporting components. That will be pretty quick. We'll talk about the difference between presentational and container components. And then mainly we'll talk about React state and how we use forms with React and how we can make inputs in React controlled, how we can create controlled forms. And obviously we'll also talk about event handlers and the way that React deals with events. All right, so first up, let's talk a little bit. This is kind of like a little sidestep on importing and exporting. And by the way, the project that we're working with is the same project that we had yesterday. So let me actually start this up. Yarn start or npm start. They both work. And then we'll spin up a server real quick. Okay, and then the application, if we just kind of walk through it super quick, we still have our app component. Some of the syntax might be a little different, but this is pretty much what we had yesterday. We have our like recipe list that iterates over all of our recipes, and then for each recipe, we render our recipe component.
Emily, can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
I think it's in the recipe list where you have your map. Is there a reason why you're doing the map in the return versus between the function and the return?
Not in particular. I guess this happens a lot in the labs, right? Where you create like a separate function that will like render a certain piece. We can do that too. In fact, let's go ahead and do that real quick, just to see like what the difference is. So all I need to do here, we're really just kind of factoring this out into a separate function. This could be a function declaration. It could be a function expression. It doesn't really matter. Let's call this render recipes. All right. Okay. So what we want to do inside of here is we essentially want to take all of this code that's inside of the curly brackets. Let's go ahead and like copy this, and I'll leave that part in here so we can look at them both. So I'm going to take all of this code that's inside the curly brackets, cut it, throw it inside of my function, and put a return keyword in front. And then wherever I cut my my code right here, I'm going to execute my function. This does the exact same thing as if you were writing it inline. There's no reason that we could also like use an implicit return here since we're using an arrow function. Doesn't really matter. It looks a little long. Let's do explicit. Okay. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. One of them is inline, one of them is like factored out. It's a separate function. I would say again here, whichever way you feel more comfortable with would be the way to go. Cool. I guess one advantage that you might have is your return might become a little bit more readable if you factor this out. So that's kind of cool. If you have like a lot of code in here and you're doing it all in line, sometimes it's a little hard to read. So if you think that this is more readable, definitely go for it. Cool. So far, all of the every time that we've exported something, at least in lecture, we've used a default export. Right, so let's talk about the different types of exports and imports that we have. There are really only two different ways that we can export something from a JavaScript file. One of them is the default with a default keyword, which means that we can, if we use the default keyword, there's a particular rule about the default keyword is that you can only ever export one thing with the default keyword from one file. So if we had another export here with a default keyword, that would not work, right? If you want to export multiple things from a file, you can use named exports. We'll talk about named exports in a second. The default keyword means that, again, you can only ever use it once in a file to export one default component, one default function. And whenever you're importing it, so let's take a look at our app component. Right here, we're importing the recipe list, right? Whenever we're importing it, we can name this import that we're creating here. We can name this whatever we want. We'll name this potato, and then we have to make sure that we rename this right here. As long as we are importing from the correct location, whatever we are importing here is going to be coming from the default export. If we want to rename this for some reason, I can't think of a good reason that we want to do that here. We can do that. We can name this whatever we want because it is a default export. Usually you won't see that a whole lot. You'll just import it with the same name, but it is possible. So that is what a default export is. Let's see if we have anything else here. So this is our default export. This is the way that we import it. A named export, on the other hand, looks like this. So we have, let's grab this real quick. If we go to our recipe component, so what we can do is we can export our recipe here. And this actually needs to be in curly brackets. That is a mistake in the README. I apologize. Let's fix that real quick. Okay, so what we've done here in our recipe component is we have created a named export, which means that named exports you can have as many of as you want. Unlike with default exports, you can export as many things as you want when they are named exports. So if we have another component here that returns something, we can also export this in addition to our first component. The thing about named exports is that it matters if we import them a little bit differently than we do with default exports. If we wanted to grab this recipe here from our recipe file, what we'd have to do is we have to wrap our recipe in curly brackets. Oh, I removed that, sorry. So we're wrapping our recipe here in curly brackets because now this is not a default export anymore, but it is a named export. If we had another component, we could just chain those, just add a comma to import all of those as well. Most of what you're probably going to be doing is using default exports, but if you for some reason want to have multiple components in one file, you can use named exports. You can also mix and match. You can use default exports and named exports in the same file. That's fine, as long as you don't use more than one default export. Any questions about that?
So with regards to that last comment where you can export the default and named component, so you could export everything, or you could just at the same time export a certain component from the same file into another same file. Is that what you meant?
You mean like mixing the two, like having default and named exports?
Yeah, in the same file. Like here we have export and default back there under the recipes.
Right. So if we had like let's call this named export. I'm not saying that you're actually going to be doing this a whole lot. Probably you likely won't. But all I'm trying to say is that, let's make this default again, is that it is possible to have both a default export and a named export in one file. Does that answer your question? Or?
And these are in the recipe.js file, making sure I'm tracking. Yeah. And the named export was coming from the recipe list. I guess that's where I'm confused, is that on the recipe list, this,
So in the recipe list right now, we're importing it as a default, like the recipe. If we were to also, if we wanted to also import the named exports, actually what we should be able to do is say, also take the named export. You will see this a lot actually with React when you're importing from React, right? So import React, if you've gotten to use class components, you will say something, you might say something like also import my component from React as well, right? So this is, in this case, that would be considered a named export. And this is your default export right here. I don't know if that
but essentially you
makes
get the
anything
same
clear.
thing. Don't you get, for like line 7 on recipes, you get the named export as well?
No. Yeah, I think I know what you mean, because what you can do with the way that React is exported, and this is true for a lot of packages that you use, is what you can say is you can say either react.component, right? Or you can just import that component directly. So component is a property on the React object, but it is also a separate export from that like React file. So you have to like go out of your way to export something if you want to be able like to export it via a named export, if you want to be able to import it via a named export. I don't know if that makes sense, makes more sense, or makes it just more confusing. Well,
Yeah.
Is there someone maybe that like maybe there's a piece that I'm missing here? If there's someone that has a different way of explaining it, would you like to do that?
Yeah, or just to say it a different way, like the export default in the file where the export keyword is used, export default recipe is saying from this file, the default export is the recipe, whatever that variable is. It might be a class, it might be a function, it might be whatever that is, but export that code, that function or class when we import this file. And then in the file that's imported, your import recipe from that recipe file, that because it's not wrapped in brackets, you're just importing whatever the export default is from that thing. I could be wrong here, and this is part of my question, but like we're in recipe list.js where it says import recipe from .recipe, we could just as easily say import pickle-rick from .recipe, and that would import the recipe object, and then in the import file, it would name it pickle-rick. I don't know why I'm fascinated with using pickle-rick as I just like it. But anyway, so because it's not in brackets, it's taking whatever the default is of the export file. But if we didn't have an export default, we would need to name the component that we're importing that, and it would need to be named as an export of the file that we're importing from.
Yeah, so the
Does
names will have to match in that case.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
because it's in the braces. So, and the notation that way is the same on both sides. But if it's like anyway, that's kind of like a different way to explain it. Hopefully that makes sense.
But I think what you just used the word class. I think that's where I was a little bit confused, because in all the labs we've been exporting the class.
Yeah.
And everything in the class, and for some reason I kept thinking that default recipe was exporting the class out of habit of looking at everything.
Right. And it's just
actually
in this
recipe
case.
And named export are two different functions or function expressions that we're exporting. Not one is a class, which would also give you named export if that named export was in the class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is what's happening
it doesn't. Go ahead, Alec.
I was going to say, which is what's happening with React and component. Component is I'm assuming something inside the React, whatever it is, a function, a class, whatever it is in there, an object. So then because React is there, you can import component from that React class because of the way the export is. That might have just gotten confusing, but exactly what you said, Brad, which is, yeah, It's two separate things. And if named export were inside recipe, then you would need to write it differently.
And what else did I want to say? Just totally slipped my mind. Yeah, thank you, Alec. Does that explain things a little bit better, Brian?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, realizing that it's not a class that we're trying to export here, I think made me realize why you could have a default and a named export as well, because they're both
Right. So
getting out two things.
yeah. So the other thing I wanted to that I just what just slipped my mind that I wanted to mention, it doesn't matter if this is an error function, doesn't matter if it's a function expression, doesn't matter if it's a function declaration, a simple variable, a class. You can export all of those things the same way, either by default or via named export. However, you want to do it, as long as you're importing it the correct way also. Okay. Let's move on. What's this recipe?
And then I just had a quick question here too.
Yeah.
Is the way we had export named export there the same way as writing? Because I've also seen it written in files where it's like export is in line with the definition, where it would be like export const. Is that the same thing as writing? Those two are the same thing. Cool. Okay.
Correct.
Awesome.
Yes.
Great.
So the one place that you might see named exports a little bit more is, let's see, in like a utilities file, right? So if you have a utilities file where, I don't know, say you have like a function that will format all your dates. You have a function that will, I don't know, format something else. You might have like a lot of different functions in this utilities file that you're using all over your application. That is when you would want to use named exports, because they're like small functions that you're exporting, like that there's no point in having multiple files for those. And then you want to have multiple exports in one file and not just use a default export. Okay. All right, let's move on with our material. Let's talk a little bit about presentational versus container components. I assume you maybe heard a little bit about this already. So the main difference, this is really just like a syntactic difference that we are that presentational and container components have, which is that container components tend to be, first of all, like the parents of your presentational components. They are the components that have a lot of logic in them. With what you're learning right now, they tend to be classes. They might have state in them. They might have other kind of lifecycle methods. We'll talk about lifecycle methods as well. They have a lot of logic that they probably are going to pass down to child components. Child components, scratch that, presentational components are components that don't contain a whole lot of logic. So it is usually just components that actually are just there to present something a certain way. So think of like if you had a component for a button, right? There's not going to be a whole lot of logic inside of that component, but it's there in order to display the button in a certain way. A good example here for the application that we have is our recipe component is clearly a presentational component. It doesn't really have any logic in it. It doesn't keep any kind of state at this point. It's really just there in order to present, in order to display that recipe name on our page. Right now, our recipe list component also should be considered a presentational component. Also doesn't have a whole lot of logic in it. Once we get into like actually building out our application a little bit more, our app component is probably going to turn into more of a container component, because we're going to be keeping state here. We're going to be keeping a lot of logic here. And it's going to pass that logic down to our other components. Any questions about presentational versus container components? There's no right or wrong when you're trying to like figure out which component to use. It kind of depends on the use case, right? So if you're thinking about like, oh, I'm going to build this component and it's going to keep a lot of state and it's going to do a whole lot of things, then that would technically be considered a container component. You might see here and there that you have your components in different folders. One of them might be called presentational or something like that. One of them might be containers, or you might have a container and just a components folder, which would keep your presentational components. That is totally up to you. There's not one rule around how you need to structure your application. And keep in mind that if you start structuring your application, it doesn't have to be perfect at first, right? You can always revisit the structure that you have. You can always revisit what your components are doing. Make sure that you refactor your code and move things around the way that you see fit. There's actually a kind of a cool or something that like underlines what I'm saying. In the like an article in the React docs, I think it's like React file structure, which will essentially give you a couple of ideas on like what is a recommended file structure, right? There are different ways that we can structure this, but the best part about this is, to me, is don't overthink it, right? Just kind of get started. Start with something that makes sense to you, and then feel free to rework that, right? Once your application gets going, and this is more for when you get to project week, once you get more into your application, you will be the best person to understand like where things should go and how to structure your application. So feel free to check this out. I'll post it in our channel. This is another one of those things that that you're not very used to with Rails, which is like, oh, just JavaScript, like do it however you think. There's so many different ways of doing it. You get to decide, right? Or you have to decide. Any questions about these different types of components?
Just so I've got it straight in my brain, there was that in some of the labs it references that article from Dan Abramov about like where he changed his mind on using containers a lot and stuff like that. And is that, I guess I just want to make sure it's straight in my brain, is that talking about using hooks instead of something, or just not using containers, or keeping global state, or because he talks about it, he's like, I no longer, it's literally just a note, like, yeah, that's the one at the top there. It's a big article about presentational and container components, and then there's literally just this note at the top that says, my views have since involved. I don't suggest splitting your contained components like this anymore. This pattern can be handy. Hooks, let me do the same thing with that. Okay, actually that answers my question.
Yeah, so I actually agree with this. Essentially what he's saying is that, and we're not gonna we might not have the time to dive too much into hooks. I would encourage you to look into that. With how React has changed, there's not really a point in like necessarily putting a name to these things, right? So you don't have to say like, okay, this is a presentational component, this is a container component. You're really just like building these little pockets of code and pockets of functionality all over your application. If there are presentational components or container components, it doesn't really matter as long as they like integrate within your application. And the part about hooks is also that I mentioned that a lot of times like a a class component will be considered a container component. Now that we have hooks available to us, we can turn functional components essentially into container components because they can do a lot of logic without having to be class components. But this is getting like, this would get like super deep if we went down more this rabbit hole. But I do want to say pretty much anything you read by Dan Abramov, like it's like the Bible. He's great. He's great at writing out explaining technical concepts, and he probably knows more than most people about React. So check out his articles.
And that really answered my question. I just wanted to like separate it in my brain from like what is this, would this be distinct from? So that just helped me kind of put it over there. So thanks.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so the same kind of rule goes here, which is that it's kind of up to you how you want to do that. If you feel comfortable with the concept of separating out your components into like presentational container, that's totally fine. If you don't feel comfortable with that, if you want to do it a different way, that's fine too. It's up to how you want to structure your project. Okay, so let's dive into state. And this is going to be like the main part of our lecture. And I would like to, so what I want to do is I want to build, we started our recipe application. Right now we are just like showing a list of recipes. I want the ability to be able to add a recipe to my list. So I want to take my, let me jump back here real quick. I essentially want to take my recipes array right here and make it so that I can add something to this array, right? So in React, the way that we deal with data that can change in some way, you might think like, oh, why don't I just like go ahead and like push into this array, right? And then like everything will update or something like that. That's not exactly how React works. The way that React works is that we have this, so we are in a class component here. Let's actually, before I get more into state, I think you've all like written a class component before, but let's talk about this real quick because we didn't do that yesterday. So compared to a functional component that like we had yesterday, if we have our app, this is a functional component. We return something, return, right? Let's return like a div. Okay, so this is a functional component right here, and then this is a class component. A couple of things about class components that are important. If you want to build the most basic class component and use it just like you would a functional component, one thing to remember is that you always have to have a render method inside of that class component. The render method needs to have a return keyword inside of it. So just like you would return inside of a functional component, you do that in a class component as well, but it needs to be inside of the render method. The render method is like a special method that will determine like eventually what you're going to render on the page, like what's going to be shown on the page. So if you want to just build a super simple class component, make sure you have your render method. Class components are cool because you can add a whole lot of other functionality to them that you cannot, now you can with hooks, but you could previously not use this type of functionality in functional components, which is adding state to your component. Adding state using lifecycle methods. These used to be all functionalities that were privy just to class components. So we're going to learn about how to use state, which again, and we're not going to dive into this too much, you can nowadays do with functional components as well via hooks. But we're going to be using class components here in order to create our state. So the way that there are two different ways that we can create state inside of a class component. One is inside of a constructor. Does someone remember what the constructor method is similar to in Ruby.
Initialize.
Initialize, yeah. We talked about the constructor a little bit when we went through our OO lecture. One thing that you need to have, because remember we are extending, we are inheriting logic from another class right here, right? So we are extending our app component, and we are grabbing this like component class from our React library. And here, by the way, we can do the same thing that we did with that we talked about earlier. We could either say React.component, or we can import the component as a named import. So inside of the constructor here, which is like similar to initialize, this is something that we run at the very beginning of like initialization of our class. We have to make sure that we have our super keyword because we are inheriting from another class. And then inside of here, we can create state. So we can say this.state equals an object or whatever you want it to be. It can be an array. It can be, can be anything you want. This is one way that we can create state inside of a class component. There's another way, and you might see this a little bit more often nowadays because it's just more concise, which is just saying state equals an object. Either way works, right? Like if you look at these two pieces of code here, they are pretty much equivalent. They do the exact same thing. The one reason that we used to use the constructor a lot and have to write like 4 lines of code instead of 1 is because this is where we would bind functions. So we would, if we have, we'll talk about this keyword as well a little bit more. But remember in our OO lecture that with this keyword, sometimes we have a problem of like losing context, right? We sometimes default back to the global object. And that wouldn't really get us anywhere. We need to keep this keyword like kind of sticking around, and that is when we would like bind our functions inside of our constructor. That used to be a common thing. It's not something that we really do very much anymore because now we have arrow functions, but you might see this still around. We're going to stick with a simple syntax of just declaring state here at the top, and then going from there. Any questions here so far about state?
So the reason you don't use this on the way we have it currently written is because of the global aspect of it. It could be confusing, or it would not work that way correctly. I don't know if I asked that question properly.
The reason I don't use this where?
On line 6.
Oh, like this dot state?
Yeah.
So that is not how we would declare. So one thing about classes is if we create any kind of methods, for instance, in a class, or variables, we don't use our, like if we create a method, we wouldn't use our function keyword, right? We wouldn't say function, my function is something, right? Because we're inside of a class body, we need to make sure that we're actually, what we're creating is we're creating methods, right? We're creating methods on that class. So we don't use like this keyword here. Okay, I see what you mean, because in the constructor we did, right? Because we are in the class context, I guess, would be the quick answer to that. But also there's no way of like using our like const or function or var variables in the class body directly. I don't know if that answers your question, Daniel.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, cool.
Is state then a reserved keyword? So why we don't need like var let const declared on the front?
So in yeah, so state is like a special special keyword here because there are also ways that we need to change state, that we're going to be changing state. And in order to be able to like change state, we need to know like where state lives. So we need to know, we know based on that keyword. Yes. So yeah. Any other questions?
And with the constructor property or with including the constructor method, is that, so if I need to set state on a component from its props, is the constructor property the only way to do that? Or could I just do state equals, open it up, and then set the keys to the prop values?
If you are setting, say that one more time. Oh, from the props.
Yeah.
Oh, got it. No,
Is that
you
the only
can,
way to do it? Or could I just use state equals and then in the object keys use this dot props?
this, you can use this dot props here.
Okay, good.
So
Okay, cool.
if we say like recipes, this dot props dot recipes.
Okay, that's nice.
Right. So you could do
Okay,
it either
good.
way. So that's why you don't really need, like the constructor isn't really necessary anymore, because we can do without nowadays. Awesome. So let's so first of all, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. The reason that, you know, we even care about state, like why don't we just like change this array directly, right? Is because of the way that that React re-renders your components. So if we say we want to add a recipe to our recipes array, and we just write a function somewhere that pushes something to this array, at that point, React is not going to know that there's been any kind of change that happened, right? The only way that React knows that something has changed, and the only way that React knows that it needs to re-render a component, is whenever either props or state change. These are the two ways that make a component re-render. If we're updating our array right here, that doesn't mean that this is, like in this case here, this is neither props nor is it state. So your component doesn't know to re-render anything. So if we have some kind of values that that we know are going to change in some way, like we add something to an array, we change a value of like an input field or something like that, we know that these things need to live in state. So because we want to add a new recipe to our recipes list, what we're going to do is we're going to create an array here inside of our state and key value pair for our recipes. And then we're going to be using that from now on to reference, as opposed to this constant variable of recipes. So wherever we're using our recipes or passing them down, we need to say this dot state. That is how we access our state, saying this dot state. And then whatever key we want to pull out of that object. In this case, our key is recipes. We could also say our state is just an array, hypothetically, right? And then recipes would be this dot state. It doesn't really matter which one you use. You will see state often written as an object because you tend to like add things to it. So if you want to add another key value pair, that's easy to do. So the only refactor we've made so far is everything re-renders just the same way, is that instead of using a constant inside of our render method, we are now using state that holds all of our recipes, and we are passing that down by saying this.state.recipes. Any questions here? All right, so Nathan, did you have a question?
No, I forgot that it was iterating through the recipes on another tab.
Yeah,
but,
in the
yeah.
recipe list right here.
Mhm.
By the way, like, can I get maybe like a show of hands? Which way do you prefer your like your iteration, like which way do you understand better? Is it factoring out into a separate function and then calling that function here? Or let's start with do you prefer the inline way? Hands. Okay, I see a couple of hands. Okay. And who prefers the way of like factoring out into separate function? Okay. Okay. Wow. Okay. So I got like, it seemed like almost half and half. All right. So we'll practice both. I just want to make sure that you like understand, you don't technically have to understand both ways. If you feel more comfortable with one way, the other way will come with time. But let's practice both. Okay, so let's jump back to our app component. So if now let's give this another value here. Let's say is all right. I want to create like a. I want to talk a little bit about events and how to handle events. Let's create a button here and say click me, and then we'll create like a text value here and we'll say that's hello. Okay. So, or let's actually let's do this. All right. So we're gonna create a button here, and inside of this button, the text for the button is going to come from our state. So we're going to say this.state.text value. Let's make this button text. That's better. Is going to come from our state. So right now it says click me, right? Now what I want to do is I want to be able to click this button. So when I click this button, I want, let's say I want a button text to change. So I'm going to click and I want, first of all, I want something to happen. Let's start with just a console log. So clicking the button should console log something. Does someone know how I add a click handler in React?
You could add an on-click event into your button within the first, within there. And then you send it to a console log function.
Cool. So let's create a separate function here, method, log something. Okay, and inside of here, we're just gonna like console log hello. So we're gonna take this method right here and paste this in as our callback to our on-click handler. Remember that if you're inside of a class component, the way that you reference methods is by prepending the this keyword, right? There's no other way that you can reference these methods. In fact, if VS Code should do this automatically, if you type in like log something and then hit enter, it should automatically autocomplete the this keyword for you if you're inside of a class component. So if you're not quite sure, use some help, use some VS Code help. All right, so now we have a click handler on this button. If we click this button, we are executing our function. So we are actually console logging something down here. The way that
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
What is the arrow inside of line 21 in between this dot log something and this state.button.text? What is that little, that arrow? What is that doing?
This is part of our button tag right here. This is our opening button tag, and then this is our closing button tag. So if we kind of break this apart a little bit, our on-click always has to be inside of our opening button tag. So this is what it looked like before, right? All we did is we added another, like, just like you would add like, a class attribute here.
Oh, okay. I was not reading this correctly. I get it. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, so a quick thing about events in React. React uses something that's called synthetic events. These are special kind of events that are like that React knows how to deal with, right? they are really not much different from the events that you've seen so far, though. So if you have, if we added an event listener previously, like a click event listener, the event that gets passed, that you can where you can prevent the default and get the event target, you can still do all of those same things with React. So if we want to take a look at our event, it's automatically passed to our callback function. This is our callback function right here. This is really not much different from the way that we attached event handlers previously. It's just a syntax. Make sure that you have your lowercase on, your uppercase C for the on click. The same thing goes for like an on submit and any other event. We still get our event right here for free. So if we console log this with our hello right here, we can see that we have an event that has a whole bunch of methods on it. This is not the same kind of browser event that we would get with vanilla JavaScript, but it's very, very similar. So if we want to take a look at our event target, for instance, our event target is still just like the button, still what you would otherwise expect. So I just wanted to mention here that while React is using something called synthetic events, and they're not exactly like the events that we've been used to so far, they're very, very similar, and you're probably not even going to run into any differences anytime soon with those events. So just treat them, I would say, treat them as you would a normal event, as you have been. Okay, so now that we can console log something, we can call a function on the click of a button. What I actually want to do, let's go ahead and change the button text every time that we click. So I want to, in order to be able to change the button text, I have to kind of think in a I have to think about what the data flow is of my application. So if we look at where the button text is coming from, we know that it's coming from state here, right? Which state is right up here. This has the click me string right here assigned to it. And we are getting this button text from our state. Now, in order to update this button text, what we can do is we can change state, because we learned earlier that the two ways that that React re-renders your component is whenever state changes or whenever props change, right? So if we change our state, our component is React is going to do all the work in the background to re-render our component, right? So all we need to do is change this button text string right here. Now, one thing about state in class components is that one thing that we cannot do is we cannot say state is now equal to some other object. We never do this. You only ever once set state equal to something like an object or an array in one place in your application. You never do this again. The only way that you should change state is by using the set state method. The set state method, what it does is it actually without using the set state method, it's the same way that you would not trigger re-render if you're using a constant here in our render method and we're pushing to our array. The same way would our state not change unless we were using the set state method. Set state method, what it does is it actually triggers a re-render of our component. So if something is changed, if we change our button text, our component is going to re-render and display this new button text. So we always want to use the set state method in order to change our state. And what do we want to change this to? Or what do we pass in here? The set state method can either take an object or can either take the change in state that you want to make, or it can take a callback function. We'll probably talk about the callback function way, see if we still have time for that later, otherwise we'll touch on it tomorrow. But this is kind of the simpler way of setting state. You pass in your object, you take your button text key and we change this to something else. So this is pretty much just like we are, oh, interesting. Okay, that's actually a great error right here that we're getting. So let's see. Let's make this a little larger. Can someone does someone have an idea why I'm getting this error here that tells me cannot read property state of undefined?
Because it's not an arrow function, this is getting bound to the global object.
Yeah. So here we're hitting our like problem with this context, right? And this error right here should be a pretty common error that you see. It doesn't necessarily have to do with this keyword or with set state. It just means that we cannot read a certain property on something else, right? So we cannot read this method or property or whatever it is of something that is undefined. So in our case, this here is undefined. And the reason, by the way, that this is undefined, just a small like side note, is because I believe React uses strict mode, and strict mode means that we're not assigning this keyword to the global object anymore, but it's going to be undefined instead, which is like better functionality, because then we don't get any surprises by maybe having a method on the global object that we didn't expect. So just FYI, the reason that we have this be undefined here is because we are in strict mode right now. Okay, so in order to make it possible to actually access this keyword here, what we can do is we can instead use an arrow function here. Because as you remember from our OO lecture, our arrow function makes it possible to, or it doesn't create a new context, right? So our this keyword will be taken from the outer context, and it won't create a new context. It won't create a new this keyword, so we don't have to worry about this being undefined or being assigned to the global object or anything like that. Any questions here? And
So there's
by
a
the way,
strong
let's-
likelihood that most of our functions in a class are probably going to be arrow functions for that reason, if we're going to be using this in particular.
Yeah, I would
Otherwise,
say
we'll run into
yes.
this issue.
Yeah, it's an easy way to prevent not running into this issue. Yeah. That it doesn't mean that you should necessarily use like arrow functions everywhere, but it is true that in React, inside of a class component, you will see arrow functions a lot because of this reason. Okay, so when we click on this button, by the way, it actually changes the text, right? We are not toggling it or anything, so it's just going to change it to clicked, and then it's not going to change it back. But this is actually, you know, doing the thing that we wanted it to do, which is it changes. So let's kind of walk through the flow real quick. Let me get my annotate tool out. So we are getting our button text from our state, right? So right here, this button text is coming from our state. Whenever we click on the button, our log something method will be called, which is here. And our log something method changes our state, changes our button text to clicked. So then we're essentially like almost like following this this circle of, right, like grabbing our button text from state, which is changing. You know, when we click, we change the state, we update the state here. So then we have to re-render and change our button text. So that's React does all of this in the background. Any questions here?
Emily, state, I was actually reading my labs because I didn't do that last time. And it was yeah, I was lacked last time. It was saying that when you set state that it doesn't update state right away. Like I know it re-renders, but it doesn't update state right away. And to add a callback to set state. I guess like my question with that is, I know when I was messing with it last time around, like sometimes it would seem like state was updated right away. Like right now, when you did click on it, it console logged clicked right away. But like in the lab and other times, there would be times where it wouldn't update. So like, is there like, I know the lab said that like it just React chooses when it updates it, but like, is there like a normal lag time or a normal time that it takes to update, or how you could know when it's going to update right away or not? And then is it habit to also put like an anonymous function after it to make it happen?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great question. So set state, what it is, it's called an asynchronous function. So just like you have fetch, for instance, right? You all know that fetch is asynchronous. And it makes a lot of, I feel like it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Like you are fetching, you're getting data from somewhere else, right? It might take time. You don't know when they're going to send back the data. Yeah, that makes sense. But I understand how like set state might not seem like this would really take any time, right? But set state is inherently an asynchronous function, which means that you cannot predict when it's going to happen. It's most of the time going to seem instant, like, oh, this just like happened instantly, but it never actually, there's no such thing as a set state that is not asynchronous. So even though you might not notice the lag, it is still an asynchronous function, which means you cannot predict when it happens. I think what you were talking about is adding another argument here, right, after you set the state, which is a callback function. So, oh, sorry. So what you can do here with set state is you can add another argument to your set state, which is a callback function. And this callback function will give you, I think this is like new state. Is that right? Will give you like your new state. Let's console log that here. And let's try this out real quick. Is that not right? Does someone know what the callback function takes? Does it give you an argument?
It's
The
the
way
previous
I saw the lab, there was no
state.
argument, and then within the object
Oh.
for console logging, or you were console logging this dot state is the way it was in the lab.
So it doesn't, right? It doesn't take an argument, but so the point about this callback function is that you can be sure that at this point, when you've reached like this line right here, that your state will have been updated, right? So this clicked, like button text of clicked will have changed once you hit this line of code inside of your callback function. That is the second argument of your set state function. So let's see if we can think of like trying to think of like a good example for when you might actually want to do this. I'll try to think of something. But if you need to be sure for some reason that state will have like the state will need to be updated once you write like certain pieces of code, you need to put it in this callback function. And I will show you in just a sec. Like, let's actually test this out. So let's put a console log down here that will print out our state, right? So let's put a console log up here as well. All right, so, and let's take out this callback function for now. All right, so I'm going to console log this dot state here, this dot state down here. Does anybody have any guesses what we might console log here for each one of our console logs?
It's going to be click me and then click.
Okay, any other guesses?
click me and click me.
All right, let's try it out. Okay, so we are have our before state update. We have our recipes. We got click me. We have our after state update. It's still click me. This is what it means for a function or method to be asynchronous. You are executing this code in the middle, but it doesn't mean that at that point, in fact, it's unlikely that the console log after is not going to be the updated text, right? But instead, it's going to be the same state that you had previously because this action here takes time. So now if we bring our callback function back here, we'll make sure that our state is updated. It's not phrased very well, but I think you get it. So if we add a console log in here, let's see. Let's call this after set state. And then this is after state has actually updated. All right, so we got 3 console logs now. If we click our button, we can see that our first 2 are the same, but our last console log here, which again, if you remember the way that we console log things when we had fetch requests, it would do the same thing, right? Because fetch is asynchronous. It would first of all log our middle console log last because we are inside of a synchronous method. And secondly, in this case, it will actually log our updated state right here. So this clicked value is now updated because we are inside of this callback function. Does that answer it? Long answer, but
Yeah, so basically, if my code is dependent on my state being updated, I would have to do a callback function within my state to then run whatever code I need that's dependent on that. Otherwise, if it's not, then eventually you'll get there. Cool, cool, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I would recommend that. I would guess that there is probably a better way of handling that though, which would be something like once we get to lifecycle methods, we'll talk about this, but having a lifecycle methods that will check for if a certain piece of state updates, then you do something, then you execute some kind of function, right? That means you don't have to have this callback function, and you kind of have that logic separated, separate in a different place. This is nowadays much easier to do, in my opinion, with hooks. So if you do get into hooks, maybe check that out. All right, so since we're a little strapped on time, let's move on here. Let's get rid of our button. Actually, I'll leave this here so y'all can look at it still. But let's actually work on our recipe, a recipe functionality of adding a new recipe. So in order to add a new recipe, I'm going to create a new component. New file, we'll call this recipe form. And inside of here, I'm going to create, let's create a class component here. By the way, if you're using VS Code, there's some super handy, I do believe that this is an extension. If someone can find what the extension is called, that you can, where it gives you presets for certain components. So if I want to create an arrow function component, I could just click on this preset right here. It will create an arrow function component. It's just pretty neat. This will create an arrow function component with props. I think there's a class component. So let's create a class component here. If you want to, this is a lot of magic. I would still recommend that you know how to write this out, obviously, but this might save you a lot of time. Okay, so let's actually make this. And I personally prefer my exports at the bottom. So I like to put them at the bottom instead of inline, but it is up to you how you want to do that. Yeah, if someone can find out what that extension is called, maybe Slack it out or something like that. That'd be cool. Otherwise, I'll do that later. Okay, so our recipe form. Let's just render this in our app component for now, and then let's go ahead and actually add something to it. So we're going to import our recipe form. And one thing that I also like to do is I like to separate my external imports. So everything that is like not written by me, I like to have those at the top, space that, like add a space in between, and then all of my internal imports, all of the ones that I'm all the components that I'm creating. It might not seem necessary at this point because we have like not very many imports, but once you get to like, 10, 15 imports at the top, it really makes it easier to read. Okay, so we have our recipe form. Right now we're just displaying some text here, but what we want to actually do is we want to create some kind of form with an input field where we can create a new recipe. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new form here. My form is going to have an input field of type text, and it's going to have an input field of type submit that will let us submit the recipe. And I have some styling in here. That's why it looks the way it does. Let's add a label as well. And let's call this recipe name. Okay, it doesn't look great. I think I should be adding some classes here, but that's fine. This works for what we have. Okay, so now I want to be able to like type something in here, hit the submit button, and ideally have a new recipe added to my list, right? First thing that happens when I hit the submit button, what happens when I hit the submit button?
Page refresh.
Yes, why is that?
Do we need to prevent the default behavior like we were in vanilla JS?
Yes, so just like we did previously, remember that a form will always try to submit, right? We're always trying to like post somewhere. So what we need to do is we need to prevent the default behavior of that form. So on the submit of this form, and the same way that we would add an onSubmit handler to a form in vanilla.js, we can add an onSubmit event handler here to our form. And let's call this function that we're going to create handle form submit. And we'll create this function in our class body. And we are going to take in an event, and we're going to prevent the default. This should look pretty familiar. Oops, forgot my this. I always do this. Do that. And now let's go ahead and just like console log something just to see if that's working. So if we hit the submit button, we are console logging hello, but we are not refreshing the page anymore. That means success. All right, so before we continue with our form submit function, one thing that I want to talk about is using controlled forms or controlled inputs in React. This is a really important part of React, which is going to be very different to how you dealt with forms previously. One thing that you need to do in React when you have inputs, or most of the time, I can't think of a good reason why you wouldn't want to do that with inputs, is you need to make your inputs controlled, fully controlled by React, which means that you are essentially keeping track of whatever the value is inside of that input field at all times. At all times, React knows, or in fact, like your state will know, what the value of your input field is going to be whenever it changes. And in order to do that, and I'll show you what the implications are of not doing this. So in order to do that, we're going to keep some state here in our class component. We'll call this input text. And it's just going to be an empty string. Right? So we have this input text state right here that we're going to link to our input field right here for our new recipe name. Let's create a placeholder here as well. Let's call this new recipe. Okay, so to our input field, we have to add two things. One thing is we have to add the value that we want this input field to reflect from our state. The other thing that we have to add is an onChange handler. The onChange handler, all it's going to do is it's going to update our state. So let's add these two things. I mentioned value. This is the actual value of like what is inside of like when we type something in here, what is that going to be? We're going to grab this from state, this.state.input text. Awesome. And then by the way, we already get a super helpful React error here that tells us that with a value prop on an input field, we need to make sure to add an onChange handler. So that's the second thing that we need to add, which is an onChange handler, onChange, an onChange handler right here that deals with what happens whenever our input field changes. So whenever someone types something into our input field, what is going to happen? And let's create another function here, call this handle onChange. Cool. And then let's just like console log something here. All right, so this function we're going to pass into our onChange right here, this handle onChange. And then whenever we type something into our input field, notice the console log down here. This isn't changing up here, but we'll deal with that in a second. But the console log shows us that we are calling this function. Every time I'm typing, I don't know if you can hear me type, but I'm typing something in. Every time I'm typing, it changes, it executes this handle onChange function right here. Now, what we actually want to do here is we want to change our state every time that we type, right? So the same way that we previously set state is how we're going to do it this time is we're going to say this set state. And we're going to change our input text to something else. Let's just change it to hello for now. So if I type something in here, our input text is going to change to hello, right? Remember that our value is linked right here, is linked to our state, right? So our state changes, which means that we type something in here. In this case, it just changes to hello. Obviously, we don't want it to always change to hello. We want it to change to whatever the user types in. Now remember, with every event handler, we get an event for free. So let's pass in our event here. And does someone remember how I get the text that is inside of an input field?
Event.target.value.
Yes,
If
exactly.
The event changes
So
on the input, yeah.
Yeah, so the value attribute on an input field will give me the actual value of what's inside of the input field. And since we have an event and our event target, right, because the onChange is on the input field itself, our event target will be the input field itself. We can say our input text is going to be event.target.value. So we're changing the input text, the state, to whatever the user types in. If I now type, it actually changes like in real time almost, right? It seems like it's real time. The user doesn't see any difference, but what we have done at this point is we've built a fully controlled input field, which means that we always know whenever we are like at every point in time what the what the value is of this particular input field. Let's highlight this a little bit. Let's console log our this.state.text or input text right here. And let's see what that looks like. So we are typing and it's console logging. Every time that we type, every time that we make a change, we have this, like, it looks kind of funny. We always have this like up-to-date value of the input value, and we have that available to us in our state. Now, the reason that we want to do this is because otherwise we would have to revert back to like old ways and using vanilla JavaScript, which means that we'd have to like find our input field on the page. We'd have to like get the value from it whenever a user submits. This is not recommended in React because React gives us the ability to keep these components, keep these input fields always controlled, so that whenever we hit this, so whenever we hit our form submit, let's actually do that here, and we console log our this.state.input text. At that point, we will always have an up-to-date version of what the input text is in our input field. So if we hit submit, see that we're console logging this value of the input field, right? This is in our form submit right here, which is called called on the submit of the form. So whenever I submit my form and I hit enter, I'm console logging this.state.input text, and I'm able to do this because I'm always keeping this value up to date whenever someone types something in. Questions?
Just so if we don't set the value to the state, then the view will just never update, right? Like it's updating the state in the background, but then it won't ever re-render the input because it's not controlled by the state. Okay. I think I just
Yes.
figured. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you can kind of play around with this.
I was like, why isn't my typing showing in my input fields? And I think that just like clicked it for me. Thank you.
Right. So you could play around with this. So like Alec was saying, if I type in here now, let's see, value. No, the on change is still. Wait. What did I? Huh. Why is this working?
I think it still works because there's no value declaration in it. But if you declared value,
You're still setting the state for the input text on there.
Right. Right. So, no, this is right. So what's happening is that because I don't have the value set here, I don't have a value attribute, I'm just kind of using it as I would use a normal input field, right? Like where you type something in and the value automatically updates on that input field. But what that also means is that, I guess
it's just it's working. It's just not feeding the value back down into the field from the state.
Right.
So
I'm trying to figure out what the problem with that is, but I can't think of it right now.
I don't think there is in this case, but I have run into issues. I'm not fully clear on if this applies, but like have run into issues with radios, checkboxes, stuff like that, because those are radios especially are pretty controlled.
Right. So I can actually think of a good example. So let's say we have a button somewhere that will, on the click of the button, we want to change the value for this input field, right? And we want to do this programmatically. We don't want to have this done by the user, but we want to do this through our code. If we did not have this value attribute here, that would not be possible. Because the way that we would do it is by setting our state, changing our state, our input text state right here, which will automatically update this value attribute. If we don't do this, we will have no access in any way to this value attribute unless we actually select the input field, change the value, and all that. So that is the reason that you'd want to have the value attribute. And generally, this is like the pattern that you follow to creating a completely controlled input field. So I wouldn't really deviate from this too much unless you, I don't know, come up with some crazy way to make things better. I can't think of anything right now, but this is like the way that you create controlled input fields. Were there any other questions? Brad, did you have a question? I thought you unmuted yourself earlier.
Yeah, so essentially we need two different handlers, one to handle the actual submit, and then one to handle the data from any of the particular form fields that we're interested in. So if we had more form fields, we would need this is another handle on change for that particular one.
Yeah, that's a great question. Technically, yes, but we can write our code a little bit more versatile to make it so that we only need one on-change handler. Let me see if we can still have time at the end, or it is the end. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go a little bit more into lunch. You are all welcome to head out to lunch if you would like to. This is recorded, so feel free to like watch the end if you do go to lunch. But I want to finish this up. It's not a whole lot more, and if we still want to at the end, we can go into how to refactor this on change for multiple inputs. Okay, and then we'll talk about that, Brad. But yes, technically that's correct what you said. Okay, so now when I hit the submit button, now that I have everything controlled, right now I'm just console logging out the actual value of the state right here. What I actually want to do is I want to add this new recipe that I just created to my recipe list, right? So in order to do that, I somehow have to get to my state that is inside of my app component, right? So what I'm going to do, and I talked yesterday, and mentioned yesterday that the only way that you can pass information down is via props. Props can only pass information down, can never pass information back up, right? You're not able to pass any information via props from like your recipe form to your app component. But the way that we can pass information back up is by using functions. By first of all passing functions to our child components and then executing those functions in our child components. Right, so let's create a function here. We'll call this add a new recipe. Right, and we're just going to kind of start with, let's just start with a console log. Hello. All right, so we now have this new function right here in our app component, is add new recipe function, and we want our recipe form to have access to this. The same way that we can pass down data and information to child components, we can also pass functions to child components. So to our recipe form, I want to pass this function right here, this add new recipe function. And I can call this the exact same thing. It doesn't really matter if you rename this or not. But I am passing it a reference to this function right here, this add new recipe function. So now inside of our recipe form, I can take this function and anywhere in one of my methods right here that I have, and I can execute it. And I have to make sure that, sorry, I'm missing a part here, that the way that I'm retrieving this function is, or the way that I'm passing this function is via props, right? So I have to say this.props.add new recipe, because that is how I get information from my parent component. So one more time, we're creating this new function right here called add new recipe. We're passing that function to our recipe form, the same way that we're passing our recipes earlier to our recipe list. The only difference is it is a function, right? Then in our recipe form, we can use that function by saying this.props. Whatever the function name is, and we are executing it here. So what that does, remember that right now we're just console logging hello, right? If I submit, I'm console logging hello. So I'm actually executing this function that is inside of my app component by clicking on this button and calling this like handle form submit function right here, which will essentially console log the hello string right here. So every time I click, it executes that function. Questions about that? Okay, I hope that's a good kind of silence. All right, so now we want to do a little bit more, which what we want to do is we want to actually pass information from our recipe form to our app component, right? The way that we always pass information down is via props. The way that we can pass information up is via function calls. So if this function right here takes an argument, let's call this new recipe, and let's log this here. What we can do inside of our recipe form is we can pass something to that function, just like we would when we call a normal function. The only difference is this is in a different component. It's really still the same thing. We're just referencing a function that's in another component. So now we're going to take our this.say.input text. Remember, this is the always up-to-date like text that we type in here. I'm going to pass this as an argument to our add new recipe function. Let's take this out. And then remember, in our app.js, we are console logging this new recipe that we're passing. So testing this submit, and we are console logging the value coming from our input field inside of our app component. And the reason that I'm doing all of this is because the only way that I can have access to all of my recipes, the only way that I can update all of my recipes is in the component that contains all of these recipes. In this case, it's my app component. My app component has the state of the state array for all the recipes. So if I want to update that, if I want to add a recipe to it, I need to do that in my app component. So here now, all I need to do is set my state and take my, and we'll talk about adding a callback function here as well, if you all want. I'm going to take, essentially, I'm going to take my previous state, this .state.recipes, and I'm going to use the spread operator here to take whatever the previous state was and spread it, like create a new array out of this. I'm going to add my new recipe to this state. This is a very common thing that you're going to be doing, using the spread operator to take previous information and add new information to it. Okay, so bacon and eggs, submit. And we are still just console logging bacon and eggs. What did I forget?
Don't we need to store it somewhere if we're creating a new array? Or should that just automatically update to the screen?
We could do that, new recipes if we wanted to. It's not necessary, but we could. Oh, I see what I'm missing. I was just missing my like recipes, my curly brackets, and then the recipes key. I was actually setting the state to, trying to set the state to just an array of recipes. So because, okay, sorry, one more time. Because our state up here is an object, right? All I want to do is I want to change the recipes key right here to this like new array. So hypothetically, what I could do inline is this right here, but I could also take this and put it in a new variable and then say recipes now equals new recipes. Okay, so bacon and eggs, submit, and it is added to our recipe list. And it is not just added to our recipe list in our state, but remember that whenever state changes, our components re-render, right? So right here, we're passing down recipes from our state. So in our recipe list, it automatically re-renders and renders this new bacon and eggs without us having to do anything. We just set up the like scaffolding for it. React does everything, the re-rendering in the background. And all we have to do is update our state, add a new recipe to it, and we will automatically add that to our list. And we can just kind of keep going with this. Pretty cool. Obviously, this is not persisted. We're not using any kind of database right now, but so if we refresh, it's all back to normal. But hypothetically, if we had a database, we'd persist that. Questions? Okay, so one other thing that I want to talk about here super quick is that set state can, besides taking like just the new state, it can also take a callback function as an argument. And the reason that you might want to do this is because set state is asynchronous, right? So if we give this a callback function, what we get for free is the previous state that that we have at this point in time. So here we have our previous state automatically passed to our set state callback function. And then what we can do is we can return, let's break this up a little bit. We want to return our new state. Right, so this is going to be some kind of new state. Why do we want to do this? Why do we care? And so what that will look like is something like this. Right, so we're still using the same code, but instead of saying this.state.recipes here, we're going to say previous state.recipes because again, that set state is asynchronous. Let's just try this out real quick. This should give us the exact same result. Yeah, okay. Because set state is asynchronous, you can never be sure that state is anything at any particular point in time. What that means is that you could have multiple functions that update state at the same time, right? Or like subsequently, and you don't know exactly when this is going to happen. And the problem with that is if we take our this.state.recipes and create our new state out of that, at this point in time, we're not sure what this.state.recipes is. With this callback function right here, we can be sure that the previous state is the state at this very point, and it doesn't change like while we are updating state or anything like that. This is just kind of a way to ensure that we don't have other pieces of code changing our state at that same time. This is like a little bit more advanced, so like feel free to, and maybe it takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around. But if with what we're doing right now, if you set state like this, that's also okay. And by the way, this is only necessary whenever you're actually referencing state directly when you're updating state. So if you say this.state.something, whenever you're setting state, you cannot be sure that this.state is any particular thing at that point in time. But with a callback function, you can be sure. Just a small side note here. Any questions?
Is there for some reason I'm remembering that there is a second argument that gets passed to the callback function in set state? Is it always just previous state that goes in there?
Oh, let's see. Is it?
I could be totally.
You also get like the props.
Literally just remembering. Oh yeah, it's props.
You also get props, yeah. I think
it
like props at that point in time.
Yeah.
So it's like you can also have props here as a second argument.
I think so.
Something like that, yeah. Right. So if you're like using props, same thing goes there.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Sweet. Okay. One last thing, and then we can we can end it here. What Brad was asking earlier about what if we have another input field, right? What if we add another input field here that also has, let's see, like the description of the recipe, right? We're not actually going to go ahead and like submit this or anything, but let's see, we have like description, text, right? It's also going to be a string, and we'll use that here instead. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so we can now, we could hypothetically create another function here, say, we'll call this handle description change, right? Something like that. And then we can call this here on the change of our on change. But we don't have to do that because we could just hypothetically reuse our handle on change. The way that we do that, or the one part that is not flexible inside of this function is the key for which input field, like for which state we're changing, right? This could either be input text, this could also be description text. The way that we do make it flexible is by adding, first of all, name attributes to our input fields. We'll call this title, or well, I guess we'll have to call this input text, sorry, input text. And then here, we'll call this description text. All right, so now each one of our input fields has these name attributes. What we can now do in our set state is, instead of saying we always want to update the input text, we're going to add a dynamic value in here that will grab the name attribute from our input fields. So if we say event.target.name, that will grab this name right here. So in this case, it's input text, but for description, it's description text, and it will just replace those with whichever one we're updating. So this is like a way that we don't have to create multiple on-change handlers, and it will still, if we console log our state here, this is like new title and then description. So see that, sorry, it's horrible spelling. See that the description text is changing as well as the input text, and they're changing separately, right? So this is one way that we can get around having to create multiple on-change handlers. All right,
really cool.
Any last questions? Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's awesome because if you have 10 input fields, you only need one on-change handler. You don't need 10. So that's pretty nice. Let's I know that we're already over time, but let's walk through the flow like one last time of what's happening, because I think that can be a little confusing sometimes. So let me try to get some of these files in view. Okay, so we have our recipe form. Maybe we put this over here. Okay, so yeah, that looks good. All right, so what happens is that I type something into my input field. I'm going to try to draw this. All right, so while I'm typing something into my input field, this is going to be a lot of drawing, so try to follow along if you're still awake. I'm typing as a user, typing something into my input field, right? That means that my on-change handler is triggered, and it updates my input text. Actually, sorry. First drawing, and it's already wrong. It calls my on-change function right here, which sets my state. It updates my state for my input text in that case. And it does that every time that I type something. Now, once I hit the submit button, my handle form submit is being called right here. My handle form submit takes my state from the input text state, right? Takes that and passes it to my add new recipe function. My add new recipe function is coming from props. So this right here is coming from my props down here. I'm setting this to, it's like coming from this over here, right? I'm setting this to my add new recipe function that is inside of this app component right here. And I'm passing, in this case, I'm passing a new recipe in here. This new recipe is going to be this dot, what this dot state dot input text is over here. So those are going to be put into that new recipe value, new recipe variable. Then what we do is we create this like new recipe array, and we set our state. We set our state within the app component to this new recipes state. So our new recipes up here, our recipes up here, change to have this new recipe in it. Now, because we are passing our recipes down to our recipe list right here, that automatically updates, right? So that means that every time we hit submit, it adds a new recipe to our recipe list right here every time that we create a new recipe. And that, now that I see it all together, it looks really confusing, but I hope it was still helpful.
Looks like a
Anybody
rugby
have?
play.
Yeah. What's that?
It looks like a rugby play or football play.
Yeah. And then you go straight through the middle, and then you get to state. Any last questions before we end it here?
I think it makes sense for the most part, but if we go through, we don't have to go through it again. But I guess next time, I feel like it'd be easier if we had numbers to also follow along after like all the lines are drawn. But
Fair
no,
enough.
it was helpful.
Okay, cool.
On the
Yeah, see if I can do that.
JavaScript, you recommended like write out your function handlers, your listeners, DOM manipulators, kind of in one form. Is there kind of recommended way you might think about like what to write in a certain sequence that you found that works for you or other people?
You mean like the order of functions, or where to put the logic for each function?
Kind of like the order of functions. The logic makes sense,
Okay.
but I think trying to figure out what you need to write and kind of when.
Yeah. I would say, like, similar to what you did with the vanilla JavaScript, is try to like create sections for functions that are somehow related. So say we did have multiple on-change handlers, these might be our, like, on-change handlers, right? So if we had another one here, we'd put another one right there. Right now we don't have a whole lot of code, but it doesn't really matter if you like have this one down here or up here. It's just kind of like how you prefer it. I can't think of like a good way to explain this. You could also put the like more important functions toward the top and the more like helper functions toward the bottom. There's so many different ways that you could hypothetically do this. If I think of anything else, I'll let you know. But just kind of like sort your function, like put your functions together that kind of belong together, that are similar in some ways. Let's say if you have like a bunch of functions that set different pieces of state, you might want to put those together in like one section. Yeah. Okay, cool. We are way over time, so let's end it here and let's go to lunch.